Ever since I was a young child, all I ever wanted to do was ride horses. I first started asking to take riding lessons at 2 years old, after many long days of playing with my mom's old Breyer horses. It wasn't until I was 4 years old that my mom was actually able to find an instructor who was willing to teach someone as young as me. For most of my riding life as a child, I rode Arabians and half Arabians. Everything I was taught was very much specific to the Arabian show circuit, and for years my understanding of horses would be colored by the riding and management practices that I was taught by the trainers that I idolized at the time. By the time I was 5 years old, I started showing on the Arabian horse circuit. I rode in the walk, trot, 10 and under classes, and at most of the shows I was the youngest person in the class. My legs barely came below the saddle flap. For my first year of riding horses, I would leave preschool or kindergarten and go straight to my lessons. I was always exhausted after and falling asleep in the car on the way home, but still, I could not get enough of it. I had dreams of eventually becoming a professional horse rider or trainer when I grew up. To me, showing was a step towards this, and it also allowed me a means of showing off what I had learned in lessons. My mom was always extremely supportive of my riding and would come to every show to help out and cheer me on. She had also grown up riding Arabians, so early on she made the best horse show mom. We got to share our mutual passion for horses, and she got to get back into the horse world. Early on, I was a go-getter as a rider and extremely fearless. The times where horses would spook and bolt on me, I would always get back on. The gray Arabian mare I'm riding in some of these photos once bolted on tiny me at a jumping show, running around out of control. While the entire crowd gasped and freaked out about this tiny person potentially falling off and dying, my mom was just yelling, "Lean back, pull back." After getting my horse back under control, I finished my course. This memory pretty accurately describes my attitude around horses my entire youth. I just wanted to be around them whether they were misbehaving or not. I was only 7 years old when my dad had a stroke. At the time, I had no concept of the severity of the situation or the impact that it would have on us. My life changed entirely that day, and when my dad did finally come home following months of hospitalization and rehabilitation, life was completely different. The injury to his brain had rendered him paralyzed on his left side. He could not walk or do most of the things he used to do without thinking. This was very hard on his mental health. My mom took over as the sole provider of the household and caretaker of us and my father. My dad was resentful not being able to go to work or do his normal daily activities, and arguments became a common occurrence in the household due to the strain that this put on everyone. More than ever, horses became my one true solace and my escape from everything. The day I got my first horse was one of the best days of my life. I was so excited. This is something I had only dreamed of for years, even before I had started riding. I just loved horses, and Farley became my best friend. And days at the barn grew even longer because I had my own horse to put all of my love into. Since he was so green, though, some of the problems that arose were the shortcuts that I was taught through my trainer to get him going how he needed to go for someone my age to be riding him and to do well at shows. A lot of these things that I had learned were so normalized that I never saw a problem with them. These things included big bits like thin twisted wires, kimber wicks, and also methods like being taught to knee him in the stomach when he bloated for his girth being done up. Being so small, I couldn't do up his girth easily, so this was one of the solutions offered to me. Despite some of my shortcomings in what I was taught in terms of management and riding of horses, I developed as a rider and Farley developed as a horse. By the time I was 12, Farley and I were doing pretty well at shows, and he was going much more consistently. My last year showing as a 13-year-old was one of our best. Then, things were just too expensive. My mom couldn't do it anymore. I had to stop showing. I moved to a cheaper barn and continued to pay off some of the board by doing feeding and bring-in, as I had the last couple of years. Starting high school made coping with my mental health struggles harder. I had immense social anxiety, and the pressure to fit in at school took me away from the barn. I would not go for weeks at a time because I couldn't motivate myself to want to go. The financial pressures at home had also gotten worse. I started working at a local smoothie place as soon as I was legally able to, so that I could contribute more to Farley's costs. Soon, we had to move Farley again, this time to an outdoor boarding situation as it was cheaper. This was the move that changed my life and brought back my interest in riding. It was also a major turning point in my understanding of equine behavior and management, and just how unfair I had been to Farley in the past and how that had affected his attitude. While some of my bad habits, like thinking it was cool to ride without a helmet, would stay for a bit longer, the change I saw in Farley once he had access to social turnout made me curious. I started pursuing a greater understanding of horses from a behavioral science perspective. This was the start of a journey to enlightenment. At the new barn, I first discovered off-the-track thoroughbreds. The barn I boarded at served as a rehoming facility for horses, and they got in a lot of ex-race horses. I got the opportunity to help out and ride and work with thoroughbreds, along with numerous other breeds of horses that came in. The barn owner was kind enough to give me one of the mares that came in for free. This was the start of an even greater passion of mine. The thoroughbred horse. I was fascinated by the athleticism and beauty of the horses, and thought it was the coolest thing to train an ex-race horse. While I was naive about how the horses were trained at the racetrack and didn't necessarily do the best job training them, I loved working with them and was eager to learn. After several months of retraining, I sold Maya to a new home and found what I would come to recognize as one of my heart horses, a beautiful black thoroughbred gelding, who I named Dallas. He had a fairly successful racing career and retired as the most honest, sweet, and well-behaved horse. I was incredibly fortunate to have him to develop my training skills on and learn more about thoroughbreds. I liked thoroughbreds before getting Dallas, but after buying him, I was absolutely smitten. He was my dream horse, and also the first horse who I had purchased entirely on my own, using the funds from Maya's sale. This was the beginning of my independence as a horse person. With Dallas, I started to develop my own way of training, starting to move further away from the rough methods that I was once taught. Without the influence of another trainer telling me everything to do, I was able to do my own research and start to try to find out what works. Even prior to having a real understanding of what positive training was, I started to use positive reinforcement to teach him tricks and also to get him comfortable in the cross ties. I began to be less quick to use punishment as well, something I was once taught to use extensively to teach manners. Dallas was always the most honest horse. I can't recall a single time he ever refused a fence. With him, I started to learn more about jumping, and I also learned about shows that were not breed specific. I also loved riding bridleless with him, and this is something that I began to make more a part of my riding. Although I was using softer equipment and not being so quick to resort to using training gadgets like draw reins or tie downs, I still did not have a good grasp on dressage and how to get a horse to correctly carry themselves. I also valued jumping more than flat work and found flat work days boring, due to the lack of tools that I had on how to train a horse to properly work on the flat. Dallas started rushing fences, and this is where I resorted back to old habits such as using a harsher bit. I used a pelham or an elevator on him frequently while jumping because of the rushing problem that I ironically created. The mistakes that I made with horses like Dallas were what I later learned how to fix through a dressage foundation as I developed my riding skills. With Dallas, I started taking lessons with a jumping trainer. This helped me to deal with some of his problems over fences, but the training I received related to dressage training was still lacking. We were still able to learn and develop at a faster pace, though, with some of the things we learned in lessons. After having Dallas almost 2 years, I came to the barn one day after a rainy spell and noticed that he was lame. Trying not to assume the worst, we had a vet come out who diagnosed him with a stifle injury and gave recommended time off and rehab. I made the decision to send Dallas to a pasture for the summer after he had rested in a small paddock for long enough. He did eventually come sound, but was definitely weaker in that stifle, and I was no longer comfortable jumping him, worrying about him getting hurt. I chose to lease him out to a family for the time being, not able to bring myself to sell him. The trainer at the time offered me a free lease on an Oldenburg gelding who had more jumping experience than anything I had ridden. I was excited. While he wasn't my type of ride due to being quite lazy, it allowed me the opportunity to grow as a rider and get out to shows on a horse with more experience. After a few months, though, I just wasn't happy and didn't want to continue paying the expenses for a horse that was not my own. I ended my lease and then made the heartbreaking decision to sell Dallas. I had lots of interest in him and ended up getting 2 offers, one at full price and one very far below my offer due to the home only looking for a companion for their horse. I took the low offer due to having a better feeling about that home. This decision would highlight many of my decisions to come when selling horses, because of how amazing of a home this ended up being for Dallas and how good I was able to feel about where I was sending him. I'm very fortunate to have chosen such a great home for Dallas because he still lives there 6.5 years later, which is amazing, and I'm even allowed to still go visit him and get updates. Being in contact with the owners like this so long term is such a real privilege, and without finding a home like that, selling him would have been even harder than it was. I was tagged in the adoption ad for his sire when I first came across Milo. Although his sire was older and closer to what I was looking for, Milo's ad intrigued me. I could not stop looking at his photo, and despite the SPCA having him listed as a yearling, and knowing that I wanted a riding horse, I just knew I needed to see him. I immediately contacted the SPCA to book to see him, and the rest was history. We later found out that he was actually 2 years old, just so incredibly growth stunted that he looked much younger. Milo would be the most challenging horse I had ever taken on yet. In the meantime, I had to find other horses to ride since Milo was too young and unbroke. He also needed a ton of groundwork basics before he could do much at all, and required a ton of patience. It was nice to get the opportunity to work with older horses in the meantime. I started to ride the horses of a woman that I used to show Arabs with, but who had also gotten out of showing. She had a beautiful Holsteiner Arabian cross named Jake that she had bred. He was easily the most talented jumper that I had ever sat on at the time. Over the winter before Milo's 3-year-old year, I found another off-the-track thoroughbred to take on as a project. Her name was Sydney, and she was a coming 5-year-old mare who had only ran 3 very unimpressive races. She'd had a fair amount of time off since and was out of shape. My understanding of nutrition had gotten better, so I was better able to properly feed Sydney and had also developed more in my ability to train horses off the track. I used much lighter equipment, only using a running martingale and a snaffle bit. This time around I opted for other exercises to try to encourage her not to rush once I started her over fences. Even still, looking back, I would have done things differently. What the hell, Milo? The next big challenge was starting Milo under saddle. I had helped start ponies under saddle at our last barn and had shadowed trainers and participated in the process, but Milo was the first horse of my own that I got to teach to ride. As a naturally very flighty horse, we definitely had our struggles. But overall, he was very good to me for the starting process. I made rookie mistakes and rushed him in some areas, but thanks to his past of abuse and neglect, he forced me to soften my methods even further, as roughness and punishment just did not work on him. This caused me to reevaluate what I had been taught even further, and I started to pursue the behavioral education from a post-secondary standpoint and read into studies more than I had in the past. Milo struggled to focus in training and was quick to be playful or reactive to anything other horses did, or sudden sounds or movements. When he reacted, he was incredibly acrobatic. This forced me to become better with my seat and improve my stickability. Even still, looking at it in hindsight, I could have prepared him better. Milo was such an important horse for me to take on in training, as he forced me to develop faster and modernize my training approach, because any mistake I made with him was amplified tenfold, compared to other horses who were easier that I had worked with. He was completely different, and everything about his behavior forced a change in me. Working with a horse as sensitive as Milo also helped me be a better rider with the thoroughbreds. The next horse I got off the track was the most difficult one I had yet. He got stressed very easily and was a lot more unpredictable than my last few, but he was beautiful. I bought him largely off of looks, and this was a huge mistake I made and learned from. He injured his coronet band the day we were going to pick him up, and I took him anyways, rehabbing the injury and continuing to work with him. But overall, from the perspective of a training and selling standpoint, purchasing him was a mistake because of that blemish. This situation helped me improve my eye when looking at horses, so I made more careful decisions next time and didn't get blinded by the chrome. In teaching Milo to jump as a 4-year-old, I started to get greedy and make mistakes. I was too quick in changing the complexity of exercises or choosing to jump him off property at shows. The lack of adequate preparation and the rushing helped create his refusal problem. He was already prone to refusals due to being a naturally cautious and flighty horse, but I worsened it by taking things too fast and stressing him out. I now introduce things like jumping much differently to horses who are incredibly nervous, having learned from my mistakes with Milo. It was a learning curve to adjust my schedule to the particular horse, instead of being influenced by what other people's young horses were able to do and cope with, and as well as worrying about how people would perceive me in terms of how much my horse was doing at that age, or how high I wanted him to be jumping in the future as he grew. Getting a job at the racetrack was a dream come true, and another example of things lining up in a funny way. The trainer who hired me initially turned me down due to me not having galloping experience when I had contacted her earlier in the year. We ended up having a mutual connection who vouched for me, and then I was allowed to come on trial. She told me only 1 in 10 newbies tend to learn how to gallop well and safely. My first horse bolted on me and I got run off the track, but somehow I was still given another chance, and I was keen to be that 1 in 10, and I did everything I could to improve quickly. The other gallop rider that had been teaching me and riding with me ended up leaving partway through that summer. Suddenly, I had to gallop all of the horses, even the hard ones. I don't think I've gotten whipped into shape faster. I went from riding around 8 horses a day to riding 16 or more, most of which being the race horses. My next OTTB project was a lovely gelding named Archie. I got him when he was 2, coming 3, and then sold him as a 4-year-old. He reminded me of Dallas personality-wise, very quiet and mature for his age. He adapted to everything pretty easily and was just overall a good boy. Trading him attracted the interest of a local police department once I posted his sales video. He was the first ex-racehorse they were ever considering as a police horse, and they loved him, but unfortunately he didn't pass the vet check to their standards due to failing a flexion. I was extremely proud to have trained a horse that they would even consider for that, especially since they did not consider thoroughbreds in the past. This further solidified my goal of continuing to promote the thoroughbred horse and try to end the stereotyping of them. With Archie, the quality of horses that I was producing really started to change, and I found that I was better able to manage and train horses off of the track to become calm and level-headed, even youngsters. This meant that my training was becoming less stressful, and I could calm even hyper-stressed horses when they came off this track. I wanted to use this style of training to further showcase just how amazing thoroughbreds are and prove that they aren't the hot-headed or crazy horses some people may claim they are. By becoming better with my timing and training approach, my relationship with Milo continued to improve. While we would still have refusals at shows, we could do other cool things that most show horses couldn't, like a galloping bridleless or trail riding bridleless. As my business developed, I was super fortunate to have a spot open up at the barn that I already boarded my horses at to live on the property. Living on the property allowed me to do self-board with my horses, which gave me more control over their routines and what they were fed, as well as lowering costs for me. This allowed me to take on more project horses and plan things a lot more than I could have in the past when I was paying for full board. It was following this move that I decided to take a huge leap of faith and make a decision that I had been dreaming of since I was a child. My boss at the racetrack gave me one of the mares that I used to gallop to retrain and rehome. She was a beautiful mare who went by the name Donut at the time. She was very typey and well-bred. Initially, I was going to train and sell her, but then the timing happened to work out to breed her to Banderas, an Oldenburg stallion, to produce what I hoped would be my next competition horse. I was only going to give it one try, and if she didn't become pregnant, I would stop and sell her. Low breeding fees for an uncomplicated breeding are how I wanted to keep costs low. I wanted to breed for a foal that I couldn't afford to purchase once it had hit the ground. I managed to keep costs even lower by selling the mare, which covered the stud fees and all breeding fees. I made an agreement with the new owner that I was to retain ownership of the foal and that the mare had to come back to my property to foal out in the spring. My next big challenge of the year was when I rescued 2 ponies from an auction where they were being bid on by a kill buyer and at risk of going to slaughter. I bought them sight unseen and had them shipped down from 13 hours away. Upon arrival, I discovered one of them was completely feral, and so the work to tame him began, and hopefully get him safe enough to be a kid's horse, since he was just a medium pony. The other horse, Roulette, was halter broke and quiet, so overall was an easy project. As I built my clientele and worked with more and more thoroughbreds, I fell in love with the idea of going to Kentucky to compete in the Thoroughbred Makeover. I sought out to make this dream a reality by purchasing one of the geldings that I galloped at the racetrack. He was a beautiful mover with a lovely personality, but unfortunately ended up being quite the problem horse in terms of injury. Shortly after acquiring him, we discovered that he had loose bone chips in one of his fetlocks and 2 slab fractures in his hind fetlocks. Injuries he should have been acutely lame with, but wasn't. We got him all booked in to go into surgery so he could properly heal. George's injuries taught me to be a lot more careful during purchases. I essentially completely swore off the flexion test as a sole means of vet checking a horse, because he had passed his with his injuries. So this made me skeptical, and it also taught me a valuable lesson in terms of what to look out for.
That is so cool.
Nice,
Thank
strong
you.
heartbeat.
Then
So
you
does
have-
everything look normal and good? Perfect.
Can you see like feet yet?
My experience with Milo in the past helped me get Simon used to people far more efficiently. With better training methods and better timing when applying them, I saw his behavior change much faster than I did in my first couple of years with Milo. Within a few months, I was starting him under saddle and he was liking to be around people. Through my courses at Guelph and my subsequent education, along with my years of experience that I'd gained through horses like Milo, as well as other horses I had ridden in those years, I was able to more quickly make change in Simon's behavior. Working with horses became so much easier and safer with the adaptations I had made to my training methods. Through using rewards, I made work enjoyable and gained the pony's trust much quicker. In the past, I had always been told to never hand feed treats or horses would get nippy. My entire behavioral education taught me the opposite, and by applying the same methods in practice, I realized just how true everything I had learned was. Waiting for the birth date of my future foal was one of the hardest things ever. Trying to contain the excitement while trying to push away any fears of the pregnancy or birth not going to plan was a difficult endeavor. The pregnancy progressed without any abnormalities or any issues at all, so this helped reduce any anxiety, but it was still a lot to wait for. When the day finally arrived, I couldn't believe it. When I saw the face of my first homebred foal, it exceeded my every wildest dream. A perfect colt with an insanely unique painted face.
Hi! Hi, little man! Oh! Oh, my goodness! Hi! Hi, little man! Hi!
Despite having such an easy pregnancy and birth, we did meet challenges when Banksy's dam was acting dangerously around him in her attempts to go back out with her old herd mates. We tried to make it work, but ultimately had to take Banksy off of her for his own safety. We luckily found a lovely nurse mare to raise him, and he took to her instantly. Taking Banksy to inspection was one of the most exciting and nerve-wracking things I've done. I knew that I thought he was wonderful, and I knew that people I knew and respected thought he was beautiful, but it was a whole different thing to get professionals within the Oldenburg Registry to judge him. When he went premium, it felt like a dream. To this day, I still can't believe how I lucked out with my first homebred. He has exceeded my every hope. Through the summer, George continued to improve and impress me while I also worked with other OTTP projects and client horses. Suddenly, the date of the Thoroughbred Makeover was basically right on top of us, and I found myself nervously boarding a plane to go and meet George in Kentucky with my mom. The Thoroughbred Makeover was a life-changing experience. Seeing all of the wonderful ex-racehorses who had been repurposed for new careers and were doing such amazing things was such an incredible environment to be in. I got to connect with a lot of incredible people who, like me, were passionate about thoroughbreds. Also, showing at Kentucky Horse Park was a dream. Because of George's rehab, our schooling was behind a lot of the other horses, but he still went right in and didn't set a foot wrong. Such a perfectly well-behaved gentleman of a 4-year-old, showing what racehorses who had retired injured and come back can really do. I was so proud of George's performance in such a different environment with drastically different weather. He went from the cold of October in Canada to a stifling heat wave in Kentucky and adjusted well and still performed. We were able to network with a lot of other great people, and it was amazing to promote my business so far away from home. Through my journey training George, I found myself a lot of incredibly valuable sponsorships and other business connections that helped set me up for success. When George got back from Kentucky, I made the decision to give him the winter off. He lived out with his brother by the same mother, Pogo, who I had recently acquired just before we went to Kentucky, after his breeder offered him to me for free. George got a well-deserved break, and I turned my focus to riding Milo more, as well as working with more projects and client horses. A few months into his break, I noticed that George was looking very slightly off in the hind end. I booked a lameness exam at the vet clinic after the holidays to have him examined. We found that he had soreness in his right stifle, but could not find a cause for it in imaging. I brought him home with the intent to give him more time off as we figured out more diagnostics. Unfortunately, after a few more weeks off, his condition suddenly worsened to where he was sometimes having his hind end slip out from underneath of him. More and more, it was looking like a neurologic issue. Started to suspect Wobbler's syndrome and also took a blood test to test for EPM. When his blood came back, we started him on Marquis, a medication that had good results for helping kill the protozoa that cause EPM. And we hoped that most of his symptoms were just related to the spinal swelling, rather than the protozoa causing permanent damage to his spinal tissues. Unfortunately, after less than a week on the medication, his condition suddenly tanked. I had to make the horrible decision to euthanize him after we noticed he no longer wanted to try getting up after he had laid down. His condition had suddenly tanked to the point where there was even some noticeable swelling on his face from the brain swelling. It was disgustingly unfair having to put down such a young and promising horse just before their 5th birthday. I was there with him when he took his last breath, and all I can hope is that he knew that. Losing George was one of my darkest times of depression. I kept wondering how his condition could decline so rapidly. This internal guilt and wondering if things could have gone differently, coupled with online hecklers outright telling me I killed him, really took a toll on my mental health. I started going to therapy, and I threw myself harder into work as a means of coping. I was also fortunate enough to get diagnosed with ADHD following these episodes of depression. Getting a diagnosis from a psychiatrist and proper treatment program helped me address some of my mental health issues that I had immensely struggled with for years, and that made it a lot harder to do my job and manage time well. When the pandemic hit, this made it harder to manage my mental health and work. It also created strain on some relationships I had made with trainers that I took lessons from. I ended up being fired from a job due to not wanting to agree with a racist statement. Despite this unfortunate event, I learned how important it was for me to stand my ground and stand up for what I believe in. I was growing more confident with myself, and I was proud of myself for not backing down and letting go of my morals, even if it meant losing a job. I started working full-time at the track again over the summer, along with working my training business, going back to 16 or more horses per day like I had my first year galloping. Full circle. It was incredibly hard to be working both jobs through the summer while they were in entirely different locations. By the end of it, I was extremely burnt out, but I was able to network and set up more connections for offering sales services to trainers at the racetrack, which helped my sales program explode, making 2020 the year where I've helped rehome the most horses that I ever had. I was also able to work with Milo this year, addressing management issues like trying to get him comfortable barefoot for the health of his feet. We did one show this year and he was phenomenal, a huge change from the extremely anxious horse in years past. Overall, despite being in the horse world for more than 20 years, much of my biggest growth has occurred recently as I furthered my education and started openly admitting mistakes that I made earlier on in my career. This has allowed me to develop a better relationship with my personal horses and has also brought in many more clients. I have had to turn clients away this year because I've been too busy, and have had people drive from out of area just to have their horses in training with me. It is incredibly humbling, and it's crazy to look back and think on myself as a young person, desperately wanting to become a horse trainer, and then compare it to where I am today. I would like to think that young me would love who I have become and would be so happy that these lifelong dreams were actually able to be achieved. My business has continued to grow and expand into selling apparel and saddle pads, along with offering training and commission services. It is so crazy to sit here and look back and consider what I was able to create on my own. So, I suppose this video is to say that I have survived some of the darkest moments of my life, moments that I thought I could never overcome. I have gone from being the girl who just felt that aching want to be someone, to have something in the horse world, to the woman who I would have watched enviously in years past. I have been able to achieve things that I never thought possible, such as buying my own truck and my own horse trailer. Horses have been such an integral part of shaping who I am and for helping me out when I am struggling emotionally. Over the last several years, I have finally adapted my practices to be more conscious of my horse's emotional needs and physical needs. I can happily say I haven't stalled horses consistently for reasons aside from medical issues in several years. All of my horses have gotten to live out 24/7 with free choice hay and friends. This has been a key to changing the personalities of any sour horses that I get in who are frustrated due to their previous management style. I will never, ever go back to the deprivation of socialization and outdoor time that I grew used to doing in my beginning years. My horses have done so much for me, and because of this, they deserve the ability to practice natural behaviors within a herd setting. I have so many special horses to thank for their patience and their kindness, even when I didn't deserve it. So, to all of you dreamers out there, don't stop dreaming. I'm glad I didn't, even when I sometimes wanted to. I have snatched some of my biggest dreams and can't wait to grab more.